Good morning, everyone. Now, welcome to our webinar for overseas teachers wanting to move to New Zealand. We're streaming from New Zealand here, Hamilton. We have Charlotte Natouche, my colleague at New Zealand Shores, dialing in from Hamilton. She's another licensed advisor from our team, and we're delighted to welcome Lynda Western, who's a team leader candidate care at Education Personnel Recruitment. Before we delve into the subject, let's see what we're going to cover today. Lynda will first tell us a little about teaching in New Zealand, what it's like, what to expect, and we will then discuss job opportunities in the education sector before going into a bit more detail with the immigration process. That's for Charlotte, and registration requirements, a bit more Lynda's department. And of course, we'll allow some time afterwards for questions we received during the registration process, quite a few of these. And we'll also address some of the questions that will pop on the during the webinar throughout if time allows. So what is teaching like in New Zealand? Lynda, you're a New Zealand trained and registered primary school teacher. Mm-hmm. You have more than 20 years of teaching experience in New Zealand and abroad. Can you tell us a bit more about your experience as a teacher, the work methods, everything about teaching in New Zealand, essentially?
Oh, gosh, might need a long time for that, Fabian. Let me give a brief summary. Yeah, so look, folks, I'm a primary trained teacher, and throughout my career, I've taught everything from, we call them new entrants here in New Zealand, right through to year 8. So that's 5-year-olds through to 13-year-olds. In New Zealand, the 11, 12 and 13-year-old age range it's kind of called the intermediate bracket, but it's actually encompassed under the primary umbrella. So primary age goes from 5 to 13 years of age. The roles I've done in my teaching career over a large span of time really is everything. I've done permanent full-time work, I've done fixed term, short-term contracts, day-to-day relief, I've done job share, part-time, everything. You know, that's one of the amazing things about teaching. It's really flexible, and it offers lots and lots of different options for people at different stages of their life. Teaching in New Zealand is really quite unique. We have obviously our Pacifica and Māori context, which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, and that is a big part of teaching here. Obviously, overseas teachers aren't expected to come in with that knowledge and expertise. In New Zealand, teaching, primary teaching is a generalist teachers. And teachers are trained at primary level to teach everything. They're expected to teach everything, and they do. And that's literacy, numeracy, it's science, it's health, it's everything. And that is not always the case for overseas teachers at primary level. A lot of overseas primary teachers are trained in specific subjects, and that just does not work here in New Zealand. You need to have a background in being a generalist teacher and cover everything. At secondary level, it's different. Our secondary teachers in New Zealand are what we call subject-specific trained. They tend to hold a bachelor degree at a minimum in their main teaching subject, and then they have a recognised teaching qualification either embedded into that or it was an additional postgraduate study.
So you do need a teaching qualification on top of your subject bachelor?
To be a secondary teacher, absolutely, yes, okay. Yeah, that's right. In the classroom perspective, obviously over time teaching has really changed. I guess I would say that teaching now is quite decentralized. There's a lot of emphasis on shared knowledge, on the teacher as the facilitator. There's a lot of collaborative planning and collaborative teaching goes on in schools right now. When new buildings are being built, when schools are renovating, schools have moved away from what we call the old traditional single cell. They still exist in a lot of places where there's 4 walls and a door, and that one teacher is responsible for that class. Right now, there's a big emphasis on what's called innovative learning environments or modern learning environments, they were called. They've just changed the vocabulary, where you might have several hundred students or just simply 2 classes of students with more than one teacher in one teaching space. So the way that kind of environment runs is quite different. You know, as I said, there's a lot of collaboration involved in teaching right now. Inquiry learning, where students, where teachers plan inquiry units, and a lot of the outcomes are directed by the students, is a big part of teaching too right now, more at primary level. Obviously with secondary level there's exams and subject specific content knowledge to get through, but at primary level it is localized curriculum is another thing that's really come in recently.
What is that about?
Yeah, localized curriculum. We have overriding curriculum documents in New Zealand, but they're very, very broad and they're not at all specific. So schools have the ability to really incorporate the local region in their curriculum, and they do. So units of study and inquiry lessons will be written all to do with what's going on in the local community. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So historically, what are opportunities like? Because we see in the news every now and again, quite often, there's not enough teachers, Is that nationwide, and have teachers always been in shortage in New Zealand?
No, they haven't. The shortage has come about over quite a long period of time. Way back last century, when I finished my teacher training and stepped foot in the classroom, the teacher training and supply was all managed by what was then the old education department. Since then, there's been a number of changes at government policy level, and in the 80s, a law was called Tomorrow's Schools, and it basically meant schools became very autonomous. The Ministry of Education relinquished control over teacher supply, and teachers basically applied on the open market for whatever role they wanted. It was very carefully managed, you know, 30 years ago, and that has all stopped. So over time, this has led to no one managing, no one overseeing how many teachers are needed in a specific sector or region, geographical region in New Zealand, which has led to what's happening currently. So, you know, right now, whilst we do have a teacher shortage in New Zealand, and of course COVID has changed that, and we're still trying to get our heads around exactly what that looks like, the teacher shortage is not evenly spread across the whole country, across both islands. It is not evenly spread across all the three sectors, the early childhood education, primary and secondary sectors, and it's certainly not evenly spread across the secondary school teaching subjects. You know, humanities subjects, the arts, music, there is no shortage. There is a shortage of secondary STEM teachers. We call them science, technology, engineering or mathematics subjects. We are not training enough of those subject specializations at secondary level. Yeah.
Right, hence the shortage. Thank you, Lynda. So, Carla, is that your experience as well? Does that reflect, does that translate to how many teachers New Zealand Shores have helped making the move over the last few years? Have you seen an increase or a shift towards more subject-specific demand?
Yeah, absolutely. Last year was a crazy busy year for our teachers, and education personnel helped a lot of them actually. So Lynda and her team. At one point I was saying to teachers that came to us, you will absolutely get a job, and 9 times out of 10 that was the case. Quite often that we would initially prompt them to first get their registration. Most schools we found wouldn't look at them without that. And then, you know, it was up to them whether they contact someone like education personnel or whether they applied directly to schools themselves. But more often than not, they were coming back to us with job offers. I think in my experience, it definitely translates to there's definitely more primary teachers out there than what there is secondary. Top of my head, I can probably only think of 2 or 3 secondary school teachers that actually got jobs personally from my clients. Obviously, there's 10 of us in the office, so other people's experience might have been different, but the vast majority of teacher clients who come to us are definitely fit into that primary school category rather than secondary school.
Okay, cool. So Charlotte, what's the process like from an immigration perspective? Do you want to say a few words about that, and then I can put a slideshow on?
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, clients who come through New Zealand Shores either come to us first with a job offer, or they come to us when they are in the process of wanting to migrate. So they may have only decided, hey, we're going to move to New Zealand and get in touch with us. So we work with them to become document ready, provide massive sets of documentation instructions, and we work with them to make sure they've got everything they need, to apply for a visa as soon as that job offer comes through. Registration with the Teaching Council is one of those. And assist with that, but we point them in the right direction of where to go. 9 times out of 10, teachers will come out on an essential skills work visa. The only difference would really be if perhaps their partner was a New Zealand citizen or resident already and they came out under partnership, or perhaps their partner got a job offer first and they had an open work visa. But for most teachers, it will be an essential skills work visa, and then they move through to the skilled migrant category to obtain residence.
Let me perhaps put that slideshow up. Can you see it all right?
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect.
Oh, so that's what you were referring to, isn't it?
Yeah, so first they get the skilled job offer and move through to the essential skills work visa, which in ordinary pre-COVID times was taking about 4 to 6 weeks to process. At the moment, for anyone who is onshore, those processing times haven't changed, which is a good thing. Then move through to the skilled migrant category to apply for residence, which is a 2-part process. So initially there was, not initially, there still is the expression of interest, which is an online form. Submit that to immigration, and then they assess it and invite you to apply for residence. EOIs are currently on hold till approximately April next year, so immigration isn't making any selections at present. But for most of our offshore clients, it's not really an issue. It's kind of affecting people here already. So normally those selections would take place every 2 weeks. Once you've been selected, you'd be invited to apply for residence, and then we submit a paper-based residence application under the skilled migrant category. There will be some changes to the essential skills work visa next year. The plan is, from what immigration have outlined, that they will be combining 6 different visas into one. But really important to note that there hasn't actually been any policy released. So we don't know what exactly that's going to look like, but ultimately it should hopefully make it a lot more of a streamlined process, both for employers and applicants.
Yeah, there is a question from Tyler there, wondering about the changes to skilled migrant and the work visas next year. So like Charlotte said, there's nothing set in stone yet. These are just bit more than ideas, but definitely not policy yet. No changes have been announced to the skilled migrant resident category, policy changes that is. And like Charlotte said, the government intends to merge 6 types of work visas into the one. And Tyler also refers to residents requiring twice the median salary threshold, twice the median wage in order to be eligible. That is meant to be a change in the residence from work category. So again, no change to skilled migrant. Charlotte, you touched on the migration timeline, or how we work. Can you talk about this a bit more in detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you'll see in front of you is basically how we as New Zealand Shores work. Clients will engage with us. They will sign a contract that obviously allows us to honour our services to you. And it means that we are liable under our code of conduct from the Immigration Advisors Authority, so you can, guarantee you're getting some good advice. Once that contract's been signed, we move through to the documentation stage, which is what I touched on just before. So we work with you to become document ready, so that when that job offer does come through, you are ready to go. 9 times out of 10, for people who are document ready, we're submitting work visas within 1 to 2 weeks, and quite often the delays mostly because we're waiting on a school to come back to us with the documentation request side. Once you've got all of your documentation, we move through to the job search stage. So like I said, that's when you'd either go and work with someone like Lynda at Education Personnel, or you can apply for jobs directly through the Education Gazette as well. That's another method that teachers use. I'd probably say most of my clients who are teachers last year went to a recruiter, just because it makes things a little bit easier for them. You know, recruiters can tell you exactly how to approach a school, what you need on your CV, what the school's looking for, and can also find roles for you which are, you know, appropriate to apply for. Once that job offer is secured, we move through to that temporary visa application. So like I said, at the moment, essential skills work visa. Of course, that's going to change next year, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Family members get so the spouse or partner obtains an open partnership work visa, and then dependent children can obtain either a student visa or a visitor visa, dependent on their age. Those temporary visas would allow you to travel to New Zealand and start work within about 4 to 6 weeks. Obviously with teachers, you're starting on a certain date. So if we submit a visa quite close to that start date, we can actually work with immigration to fast track that application as well. And immigration always do. They acknowledge that teachers generally have to start, you know, day one of a certain term. So they will make sure that that visa gets approved to allow the teacher to be in New Zealand on time for their classroom. And then we move through to the residence, so skilled migrant category, the expression of interest, and then the paper-based residence application. Some people do that straight away. Some people wait until they've been in New Zealand for a few months to sort of get themselves on their feet before they move through with that process. But luckily for teachers under the skilled migrant category, because they hold a registration with an occupational registration body, they do actually get fast tracked. So typical processing time standard is 18 months under the skilled migrant category, but with that prioritization, teachers generally get residence within 4 to 6 months.
Massive benefit there. Now we're digressing slightly, but it's a question we get literally daily. How do I get PR? How do I get PR? So there is a major difference between residence and permanent residence and citizenship in New Zealand. Charlotte, can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd probably be a millionaire if I had $1 for every time I answer this question, probably multiple times a day. So no one gets permanent residence outright. Everyone who migrates through an employment-based visa initially will get residence. That residence has conditions on it. So it has work conditions. Those work conditions will require you to remain in your skilled employment for a period of time. Generally varies between 3 to 12 months, but it also depends on how long you've already been in your job when residence is approved. So it's not one clear-cut answer for everybody. And it is something that when your residence is approved, we would say to you, okay, your work condition is you must remain in your skilled employment for 4 months, 6 months, 8 months, whatever it might be. You're also granted with travel conditions. Those travel conditions mean you must remain in New Zealand for 6 months out of each year for 2 years. And then at the end of that 2-year period, once you've met both your work conditions and your travel conditions, we can apply for permanent residence. So it can only be applied for at the 2-year anniversary of you holding that residence visa, and only if you have met those conditions.
And it's very straightforward, isn't it? It's nothing like the initial residence application.
No. So permanent residence, it's a 4 or 5-page form. We send it off to immigration. They will check that you've been in the country for the required amount of time. And if you have those work conditions, we send off the relevant paperwork to demonstrate that you've been in your skilled employment for the required amount of time. And once again, that varies for everyone depending on what that work condition was. So basically you're a resident for 2 years. If you're looking to apply for citizenship, you then have to be a permanent resident for 3 years. It's almost the easiest way to explain it. If you're a resident for 2 years, permanent resident for 3, and then after a total of 5 years, you can apply for citizenship. Citizenship does have some requirements for how long you've spent in New Zealand. Obviously, you have to have demonstrated a commitment to the country before they will grant you citizenship. So you couldn't get your permanent residence and disappear for 3 years and then come back and apply for citizenship.
Right. Okay, cool. Thanks for that. Let me check if we've got anything else. No, that's it on that presentation. Awesome. Thanks for that, Charlotte. Moving on. Lynda, Charlotte touched very briefly on teachers needing registration in New Zealand. Can you explain the process more in depth? We have quite a few questions on that.
Yeah, sure. So look, it's mandatory for teachers across the early childhood education, primary and secondary sectors to hold a current practicing certificate with the New Zealand Teaching Council. You can't teach without it. You can't teach in any capacity without it. You need it to take up a full-term role, a short-term contract, even day-to-day relief teaching or supply or substitute, whatever you call it in your country. Teachers need to be registered, so there's no exceptions to that rule. There's a couple of steps involving this. The Teaching Council is a government agency, but it works very closely with another government agency called the New Zealand Qualifications Authority. And overseas teachers have to have their tertiary qualifications assessed by the New Zealand Qualifications Authority. And this outcome is needed by the council. Now, the New Zealand Qualifications Authority have actually published a pre-approved list of overseas teaching qualifications from some countries already. It's not as simple as if your qualifications from the UK, it's pre-approved. There are specific qualifications from specific universities from within very specific time frames. And then there are some additional criteria that have to be met as well. So the first thing you actually need to figure out is my overseas teaching qualification on that pre-approved list? If it is, you've established that it is, that's great. That means you don't need to have it assessed by NZQA. Your first step would then be to apply to the council. If your overseas teaching qualification is not on that list, you would then have to submit that application. It's a digital online application where you fill out the fields, you create an account, upload the required documents, obviously your qualification documents, your degree certificates, transcripts, that kind of thing. And the role of what they're going to do is they're going to determine whether your overseas teaching qualification contains the core knowledge requirements, is the terminology they use, to what's required in a New Zealand teaching qualification. They're basically making a decision, is this teaching qualification kind of similar or vastly different to how New Zealand teachers are trained? And those two outcomes are really crucial. The Teaching Council need to know that. If you receive an outcome of it's kind of similar, which means it does contain those core knowledge requirements. It's not quite a rubber stamp, but your Teaching Council application will be a whole lot straightforward, and there is greater assurance that you would be granted a practicing certificate. Nothing ever is a given, but greater assurance is what I'd say to that. If your NZQA outcome states that your teaching qualification does not contain those core knowledge requirements, then what happens is you are required to apply for registration via the discretionary pathway. The discretionary pathway is a process where there are 12 council members. They meet monthly, only once a month, and those 12 council members will look at your entire application as a whole. So they won't just consider the teaching qualification. They're going to look at your whole teaching career. When you train, what your career looks like, whether it spans 10 years or 30 years. What you will need to submit appraisals, recent appraisals. You will need to submit lists of professional development you've done, any positions of responsibility. So they will take all of that into account when they make a decision on whether to grant you a practicing certificate or not. Those discretionary pathway applications take a whole lot longer. So I know Charlotte's talked a lot about time frame. You need to keep that in mind. When your application is received at the council, if you are advised that you need to submit a discretionary pathway application, they give you another month to gather the additional documents, which you need to take full advantage of, because your job is to make a case to support your application, make it as strong as possible. Yeah.
Okay, so even though the borders are closed and possibly reopening early next year, it's probably a good idea to get things started right now, because it could take some time, if only for registration.
Yes. Look, we know people that have had discretionary pathway applications and teachers that we've helped, secure work with. It can take up to 6 months. Wow. A case study, we had a UK technology teacher a couple of years ago. We met him in February in the UK. He got a job for the following year in March, so 9 months. and just every hurdle, his qualification package, every single hurdle that Michael did happen to Michael, and it took that whole period of time to get him over the line and actually get him here and start teaching.
Right, so piece of advice, plan ahead.
Absolutely. So yeah, hang on. Sorry, Fabian. Just along with the council application, people get muddled. The New Zealand Qualifications Authority and the council are two completely separate government agencies. The council application is a hard copy paper-based application, and they require certified copies of documents. So police checks from where you are and where you have lived for the previous 10 years for 12 months or more. Identity documents. So, there's some documents that need to be sourced as well for this. So, back to Fabian's point, timeline, start preparing and gathering those documents. Yeah.
So as we saw, there are different levels of teaching from ECE, so early childhood education, kindergarten and all, to tertiary. Are requirements different as far as registration goes, or do you need to, is there such a thing as a subject-specific registration? How does that work here?
No, in New Zealand, to be well, for early childhood, primary and secondary, every teacher must hold registration with a current practicing certificate by the council. That is not needed for tertiary, and that's not an arena that we at ep.education work in. So yeah, registration is required for early childhood, primary, secondary. In New Zealand, registration is not sector specific. So in theory, I trained as a primary school teacher, I'm registered. I could, in theory, tomorrow apply for a physics teaching role at a secondary school, and I'm legally entitled to do that, to undertake that role. The reality is, of course, I never would, and it's highly unlikely I would ever be offered that role. A primary trained teacher can work in the ECE sector. A secondary trained teacher cannot, even if they are registered. It's to do with funding ratios and supervision of ECE students. To work in the ECE sector, a teacher must hold a recognised ECE or primary qualification. So that's where that NZQA report comes in, to be a recognised qualification.
Right. Okay, so Charlotte, does every teacher must be registered? We sort of saw that with Lynda, but we have experience with unqualified teachers or teacher assistants or childcare workers. How does that all tie up as far as immigration is concerned?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's obviously what Lynda's talked about. If you want to go and teach at those specific levels, you need registration. Outside of that, there are what we would call unqualified teachers who can still gain visas. So is the likes of teacher aides, childcare workers, so people working in early childhood who aren't teachers, also lecturers and polytech tutors as well. So they all come under that unqualified teacher scope, and they are still eligible for visas on the basis of demonstrating that they are skilled and qualified for that role. They do have to obtain the median wage to be able to apply for a visa. Otherwise, immigration doesn't deem them skilled. So it is really important that if you are one of those unqualified teachers, that you're not looking at pay rates which are below, at the moment, the median wage is $25.50 per hour. That is expected to go up again this year. So yeah, if you're looking at anything below that, you won't get a visa for it.
Right. So as a teacher assistant or childcare worker, it might be a bit difficult to get a job at or above median wage. But as a tertiary lecturer, for example, you don't need registration, and you are likely, if not assured, to get that higher salary. So Lynda, coming back to registration, we see people with a teaching background who haven't taught recently. So they used to be a teacher and then looked at a change of career back in their home country, and now they see that teachers are in shortage in New Zealand, and they think it could be an opportunity to go back to this, and perhaps pair this with the migration to New Zealand. I haven't taught for the last 5 years or the last 10 years. Is that going to be an issue for work or registration here?
Yes, likely both. So for registration, the council considers the most previous 5 years as current and recent. So if you haven't taught in the last 5 years, You know, there's absolutely no guarantee at all that you'd be granted a practicing certificate. The Teaching Council will recommend that people undertake what's called a Teacher Education Refresh, the TER program, for people before the grant registration. If this is the case, they have a whole lot of...
Is that something they do online, or something they come here to do?
There's 2 providers in New Zealand offer it. The Open Polytech, there is an online version. However, one of the modules is a teaching practicum of 4 weeks, which must be done in New Zealand. Right. So obviously there's some barriers there for overseas people who can't get into the country. So yeah, that 5-year cutoff is really crucial. Also, from an employer's perspective, an overseas teacher who hasn't taught in New Zealand, you know, they don't know the New Zealand curriculum, they're coming to grips, they're learning all that, as well as the New Zealand culture and methodology. And then to throw in the fact that actually they haven't taught in the immediate couple of years, you know, a school wants someone with current experience. Even if it is offshore, not in New Zealand. So, you know, if you were a teacher and you want to be a teacher in New Zealand, might be a good idea to think about going back to the classroom in your home country, so at least you've got that current experience behind you and on your CV. Yeah.
Right, okay. So now, our borders are closed to most applicants from offshore. And offshore temporary visa applications are paused until 10 November. So what can a prospective teacher do right now, Charlotte? We talked about gearing up and getting ready, planning ahead. What can you do from the immigration perspective? And then Lynda will talk about what we can do right now from a registration perspective.
Yeah, we have a huge number of clients at the moment who have spent the good majority of this year taking things slow and getting all of their documentation ready so that they are document ready. As soon as border restrictions do ease. So hopefully we start to see more easing of those restrictions early next year. Obviously a little bit of a wait and see at the moment, but keeping positive on that. So yeah, we can work through with you to get, you know, your work experience references, your police clearances, your identity documents, all of those crucial things that you are going to need to be able to apply for a visa. Of course, we also advise you to go get your registration underway, but Lynda will be able to talk more on that because she's the expert in that field, not me. But yeah, at the moment, if you are really interested, definitely start looking at what you can do to make yourself document ready to be able to go and apply for jobs.
Yeah.
Lynda, from your end?
Yeah, building on that, Charlotte, obviously document ready to walk into a classroom and start teaching is the answer. If you need to get your qualifications assessed, get that done. Apply for teacher registration, definitely. On our ep.education website too, we've got recorded webinars that you can jump on and listen how to submit those applications. So there's a lot of support for that. Yeah, definitely. Right now, in working with us at EP, look, we are still interested in looking at overseas teachers. We are selective with the teachers that we are prepared to work with. We can't work with every teacher that knocks on our door, unfortunately. We're prepared to review CVs, build a profile on you, and that profile would mean you complete our application and declaration form. We contact your nominated referees. We actually ask our overseas teachers to complete a one-way video answering some questions. It gives us some really useful insight into who you are as a teacher. That profile would then be reviewed, my team and in conjunction with one of our recruitment consultants, and we would then at that point let you know whether or not we can actually progress working with you or not. And you know, there could be any number of reasons for that. It might be we just really don't think you are employable to a New Zealand school, and there could be any number of reasons for that. Yeah. So those are your options, really. Get yourself registered. And I guess I just want to emphasize here that being granted registration by the council is absolutely no guarantee of a job offer. A lot of people get quite despondent, you know, and that's just the way it works. Of course, being registered when you apply for a role, when you're put in front of a school, means a potential employing principal is more likely to pick up your CV if they see that there's a registration number on that front page of your CV. An overseas teacher who doesn't hold registration right now in the current environment you know, I would say much less likely to secure work.
Yeah, because obviously the council goes through your qualifications, perhaps your work experience as well. So they've done quite a lot of that background check already for the school looking at employing you.
The school right now needs assurance that a teacher can step into the classroom when they need them. And knowing, you know, a teacher that applies for a role who's been registered is obviously a whole lot more attractive to that employing school than an overseas teacher who has not yet been granted registration. There's still that uncertainty.
All right. Thank you, guys. We're going to move on to questions. Before we tackle my list, let's answer some of the ones that popped in the live chat. A couple of people ask about salary range, the pay scale. How does that work? Does overseas work experience count towards that scale? Are salaries government determined? What's the minimum wage for a kindergarten teacher? Lynda, that's probably your department.
Sure. Yep. Know about salaries. So the primary and secondary teachers' pay scales are the same. There's pay parity here in New Zealand. A beginning teacher with a recognised teaching qualification will start on, I think it's 52,800. It's about that. There's just been some changes in the pay scale. Teachers are getting some pay rises right now. Lucky them. A lot of people have lost their jobs, but teachers continue to go up, so that's pretty good. Next year, in July next year, the final pay increase happens. It becomes an 8-step salary scale, so it will take 8 years to get to the top of the scale, and it will be $90,500. Currently, I think it's 87-ish. Yeah. So overseas experience does count, but not all the time. There are some parameters surrounding that. Some overseas teachers have teaching experience before they actually qualify, depending on what country they're from. Not all countries, you know, are regulated like in New Zealand for teaching. Any teaching experience gained before you actually gained a teaching qualification will not count as full credit. This is really important to know. I know some people who teach at private international schools overseas, and they can employ whoever they want. Then they go and they get a teaching qualification. A really common UK one is the PGCEI, I for independent or I for international, and those people will not get full credit for all those years teaching before they qualify. Something else that people don't realise is the outcome of that NZQA, the Qualifications Authority assessment report, has an impact on salary. For people whose outcome states that their teaching qualification is a bit different to what's in New Zealand, that has an impact on salary, where at the most half credit would be granted for teaching experience gained post-qualification. So what that means in effect is if you had to apply for registration via the discretionary pathway because of your qualification outcome report statement, you would need 16 years of service to actually be granted top of the scale. The Ministry of Education have a salary assessment unit, and they require statements of service. So it's actually another government department that a teacher who secures a role has to go through to find out their confirmed salary. You know, my team and I, we do kind of salary guesstimates all the time by looking at a CV, finding out information from teachers as to what step we think you're likely to be placed on the scale. You don't actually get that confirmed until you have a job offer. Those salary assessments are submitted by the school, the employing school, on your behalf. So yeah, so 8 steps to get to top of the pay scale, kind of mid-50s through to 90.5, and that's the base salary scale with no additional responsibilities. Teachers who pick up additional responsibilities will have what's called management units attached to this pay scale, and obviously those will bump it up even higher. So if you're team leader or curriculum leader or head of department. Yeah. And
those mid-50s actually meet the minimum requirement and the skilled migrant residence category. So just. Lynda, can I teach in New Zealand even if I'm not a native speaker?
Of English.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, of English. Yeah, the council have language competency requirements. That's one of the key questions on the TC15 application form. You have to provide evidence of your English abilities, and there's a whole list of criteria. You basically have to tick one box, and provide evidence of that. So it depends on where you're from. It depends on where you studied, what country you studied in, and whether or not that studies was conducted in English or in the native language of that country. So yes, absolutely, you can, provided, you know, if you're granted registration, obviously you meet those English language requirements.
Okay. Now, you talked earlier about the New Zealand curriculum. Obviously, it can't be an expectation that overseas teachers know the New Zealand curriculum, but is that a major disadvantage not knowing it? And how would people go about finding out a bit more information about it?
Yeah, so look, you know, obviously as an overseas trained teacher, schools don't expect you to know our curriculum inside out. You're going to be on a very steep learning curve once you get here and start teaching. There is one website I would direct you to. It's called TKI, Te Kiti Ipurangi, and it's the kind of one-stop, it's the ministry website, and it's everything to do with curriculum across all three sectors: early childhood, primary and secondary. So go there, TKI. I can put it in the chat at the end.
Yeah, yeah. After this this live, we'll circulate this this webinar to all attendees, anyone who registered, with a bit more information and our contact details, of course. Mm-hmm. A question for you, Charlotte. If we are going through New Zealand Shores immigration and our documents have been approved, I'm sort of ready to start the job search. Can I answer yes to these questions on the school application that asks if I have a work permit? We see this a lot on Seek or Trade Me or perhaps even Education Gazette. They ask you if you have a valid work visa in order to apply for the job. What's the best answer there?
Yeah, you don't necessarily want to say you have a work visa, because you don't, but you do somewhere want to indicate that you one, are working with an immigration consultancy. Sometimes that can be, you know, what gets you over the line, because employers can actually be confident that you're going to get that visa and you're going to get here. We do provide supporting documentation that outlines you are working with us. So you can include that with your applications. But if there's the option to add comments or an explanation somewhere, it's definitely best to do that and just say, whilst you don't have a work visa, you are actually eligible for one, and you can explain that your document ready, you can explain that you have your registration, which will, of course, like Lynda said, it'll help when a principal looks at you to show, to see that you've got, you know, that registration number on your application.
Right. Cool, thank you. A question that popped on the chat from several people, probably for you, Lynda. A few people are trained special needs teachers overseas via a specific form of registration or specific skill set. Is that a thing in New Zealand? So obviously we have special needs teachers, but is that the same registration process? How does that work?
Yeah, so yes, of course we have special education teachers in New Zealand. Special education, there are several different models throughout the country, really. And in some instances, our special education students are mainstreamed into generalist schools as much as possible. Obviously, there are some instances when this is not the case, the needs are too high. We do have special education schools sprinkled throughout the country to cater for those students. In New Zealand, special education teachers first train as general classroom teachers. They have to then become fully registered before they're able to do the postgraduate training in special education sector. Yes, special ed teachers do need to hold registration with the council. It's exactly the same process as for all other teachers. So yeah, so same process, apply, get registered, and then it's a case of finding the job. Yeah.
What are job opportunities like for special education teachers?
Yep, there's a need in the market, absolutely. Probably, you know, to work in one of the special education schools, obviously there's more of them in our main centres than in more rural provincial regions.
Now, another question there we had through the registration. As some of you might know, the skilled migrant, and Charlotte mentioned that earlier, the skilled migrant resident visa category has been deferred for another 6 months. Potentially reopening 1st of April. Does that mean that offshore teachers will not be able to apply for a job until that category opens again? Charlotte?
It's important to note that work visas and residence are two completely separate processes. So even though that they have deferred EOI selections for a further 6 months, doesn't mean that if border restrictions were eased and you got a job offer, that you wouldn't be able to apply for a work visa. So the main issue that, of course, people are finding is that even though they may hold those work visas, they can't proceed through residence, or they can at least get the EOI in, but they're not going to get that invitation to apply until at least April. So yes, you'd still be able to obtain a work visa, you'd still be able to come and start work in New Zealand. You're just going to have to wait a little while to apply for residence.
Cool. Okay. So on that same topic, with those new laws coming through early next year, is it still worthwhile coming over to New Zealand as a teacher and support a family? So the median wage due to increase, essentially as a teacher in New Zealand, can I make enough to support my family?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say in New Zealand, it's more common for both partners in a family to be working, but initially working on a teacher's salary would be enough to cover, your initial expenses. You probably just would want your partner to start looking for work sometime after arrival once you've settled. The median wage increasing, at worst, all it will do, you will still be able to get a work visa. It just may mean that there is a delay in being able to apply for residence while you work your way up those pay scales.
And of course, the cost of living varies from one place to another in New Zealand. The key difference between Auckland versus the rest of New Zealand, Auckland being very expensive.
Absolutely. Auckland is no different to any other big international city. The cost of living is higher. Unfortunately, there is a bigger need for teachers in Auckland, mostly because of the cost of living. A lot of people tend to move out. But yeah, I mean, what you would pay to live in Auckland is drastically different to what you'd pay to live even in Hamilton, where one of our New Zealand Shores offices is based. We're only an hour and a half down the road, really, and the cost of living is drastically cheaper here than in Auckland.
Thanks, Charlotte, for clarifying. So we talked about shortage of teachers, but that was pre-COVID. Post-COVID, how difficult would it be for someone from overseas to secure a job?
Gosh, I wish we had a crystal ball. We're getting that question all the time. The market is changing. We are still trying to get our head around how it's changing and where it's changing. We know, with all the returning Kiwis that have come home, a huge number of them are teachers. And as to where they're going, what sector they are, and are they staying, we are still trying to find out. We are hearing all kinds of anecdotal stories through the media, through our client schools. A school that traditionally we've worked with over the last 5-6 years in Auckland. I think we placed 5 teachers in there to start at the start of this year, overseas teachers. Recently said to us, I've advertised, I had over 40 applications. I haven't experienced this for many, many years, and I'd be happy with half of them. So, but we're getting not all schools are telling us that same story. So yeah, look, we're not sure is the answer to that question. What used to be black and white is now grey. Personally, I've got friends overseas at international teaching. They came home for 10 weeks for COVID. They isolated in New Zealand, were safe during the Middle Eastern summer break. They've both gone back to their roles in the Middle East. So a lot of these returning Kiwis, are they staying? We don't know yet. Yeah.
Okay. Question from Singapore. I have a bachelor in early childhood teaching and 15 years experience. Is it possible for me to bring my family and work in New Zealand?
So you'd need to be going to registration first of all, and from Singapore you'd need to have that qualification assessed by NZQA, and that teaching outcome is really crucial to determine whether or not you're actually able to teach in the ECE sector. Yeah, right. From the teaching perspective.
I can't recall if we've actually answered that. We probably should have if we haven't. What's the minimum qualification requirement in order to get registration? Diploma, bachelor, master's?
Yeah, it has to be, that question is actually really complex to unpack over time. We still have teachers in New Zealand teaching in the sector who have diplomas because they were in its day the recognised teaching qualification. Currently, all our teaching qualifications sit at bachelor level or above. So that's level 7 on the New Zealand qualifications framework. But you know, that teaching outcome for early childhood sector, either your qualification is kind of similar or vastly different to New Zealand, is crucial for that ECE sector. So it's not quite black and white. Yeah, everyone's different, every qualification is different. So you'd need to have it assessed.
We have a few university lecturers asking sort of the same question. So as we confirm, no registration is required for tertiary education teachers, but obviously your future employer would expect you to have a bachelor degree in the field you want to teach, whether engineering, history, arts, whatever it might be. And for immigration, from then immigration perspective, a lecturer is deemed a skill level 1 occupation, for which, in order to be deemed competent for immigration purposes, you need to have a bachelor degree. So that is that. Charlotte, that one's for you. Oh, sorry, Lynda, did you want to?
I was just going to say, I know from the teaching faculties at universities, because I go around a lot of the New Zealand universities working with our New Zealand new graduate teachers coming out, and they are all required to have PhDs in the teaching faculties. And my understanding is I think that's pretty much the case with most of the subjects areas at universities, is that, you know, to be a lecturer, a master's is not sufficient anymore. But I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure for teaching it is definitely a PhD as a requirement.
Awesome. So that would be for universities. I'm just mindful we have countless polytechs in New Zealand teaching sometimes more technical subjects. And from first-hand experience, we've seen marine engineers particularly getting roles in technical lecturing jobs with a bachelor degree or higher. But thanks for that, Lynda. Charlotte, with Immigration New Zealand doing away with certain visas in 2021, how will it now be possible to get residence as a teacher? The person asking the question saw that will have to be considered a high earner to get residence, and they don't think that will be the case as a teacher. I think they're referring to twice the median wage.
Yeah. So once again, it's really important to note that getting a work visa and applying for residence are completely different. So on one hand, just because you get a work visa doesn't mean you'll be eligible for residence, but it also doesn't mean that you wouldn't be eligible for residence. So yeah, it's also hard to talk on what those changes are, because whilst they've announced what I guess the broad overview is going to look like, we don't know what that policy is going to look like. No policy has been released, so we can't talk to the finer points of what that's going to look like. It's not uncommon for immigration to make these kinds of announcements 6 to 12 months in advance, and then when the policy comes out, it's drastically different to what they were actually announcing initially, just quite often because they go and do consultation with different industries and sectors and get feedback. I can't imagine that teachers will ever be in a position where they're unable to apply for residence. And I think that double the median wage, which at the moment is 106,800, I think that's more related to residence from work rather than the skilled migrant category. As it stands, the minimum pay rate required to be eligible under the skilled migrant category is $25.50 per hour. And based on what Statistics New Zealand has released, saying, you know, what they believe the new median, sorry, I'm getting my words mixed up, median pay rate is $27 per hour. So that's the most likely change we're anticipating for the skilled migrant category, is that it will go up $1.50 per hour for the minimum rate required.
Okay. On a similar note, and we might be gazing into the future a little bit there, but amongst the changes planned by Immigration New Zealand is the requirement for all employers to be accredited from next year onwards, one way or another. Do we know how that's going to work for schools? Charlotte, Lynda, you might have something to say about this as well.
Yeah, I think Lynda's done a bit more work in this space with schools, particularly from a broader, and she can talk to that in a second, but from a broader point of view, we don't know what that's going to look like for all employers. Once again, there's been no policy released. So we're also sort of anticipating what that's going to look like. And we're waiting to see what immigration releases. But I think Lynda's actually been doing some consultation with Immigration New Zealand around that, so she'll be able to talk to schools specifically.
Yeah, we have. Look, myself and my team, we've run through 3 feedback sessions. They are designing a platform. It's an online platform about every employer becoming accredited. Schools don't know this yet, and man, if they got a shock. They've never ever had to jump through these hoops before to become an accredited employer. You know, we've asked immigration questions like, given that New Zealand state and state integrated schools are government funded, wouldn't the Ministry of Education be the employer? That was a flat no. Every individual school has to become accredited, and obviously there's a fee involved with that. So schools don't know this. We don't know how it's going to work. Our feedback has been actually that the questions and the platform is really targeted at businesses. Schools are not businesses. A lot of the questions at this point for schools are not particularly relevant for education. They may be the employer, but actually it's the ministry that pays them. They're employed under a collective contract. You know, there are so many things that don't quite fit with schools having to go through this process. So yeah, we don't know the final outcome. As I said, all we've done is been consultation and given feedback. Who knows what they'll actually decide in the end. Yeah.
Yep, crystal ball gazing, very much so. An easy one, Charlotte. Is there any age limit for migrating? People consider moving to New Zealand at any point in their lives, and for some of them, the clock might be ticking.
Yeah, so under the skilled migrant category, you can apply for residence up until the day you turn 56, but there is no age limit on work visas. So you could be past the age of 56 and come out to New Zealand on a work visa. You just have to be mindful that will initially only be granted for 3 years. If you want to remain longer, you'll have to continuously apply for work visas. The downside to that is that policy can change. So just because you've initially met the policy at that point in time for a work visa doesn't necessarily mean you'll meet it again in 3 years' time. But once again, I don't really anticipate there being too many changes that would really affect teachers, given the fact that they are such a crucial part of, you know, society and our economy.
We have a lot of questions. People saying, I have a master's of this, a diploma of that, 3 years experience in this. What are opportunities like for me? Do I stand a chance to get a job? I think for all of these, you really want to reach out to Lynda. She knows what's in demand. And again, we'll circulate those contact details afterwards. Something a bit more generic there. Teacher to learner ratio per class in a school. I know from a French background, you can have 30, 40 kids plus at certain primary schools. What is it like in New Zealand?
It varies from school to school in different parts of the country. Schools are funded on a certain number of students per class at different levels as the age group, as a student moves through the schools are funded on a different ratio. So I think for new entrants, for 5-year-olds, it might be 1 to 15. As they move through, as obviously it might be 1 to 28, I think, by the time it gets to kind of year 5, 6, 10, 12-year-olds. It might go up to 30-ish, I'm not exactly sure. Of course, then what actually happens is, depending on how the school staff their school, there would be some fluctuations surrounding that. Yeah.
Cool. So for teaching registration, the minimum requirement is a bachelor's degree. Do people stand a higher chance of getting a job if they have a master's degree?
Not necessarily. You know, that would come down to experience. Depends on what the master's is in. But not necessarily.
Cool. Another question more about life in New Zealand. If I get a job, I get a visa, I can come here with my family. Do I need to pay for health insurance, Charlotte?
So we have state-funded health care here in New Zealand, which is world class. You know, it's not, if you have health insurance, absolutely, you're able to. It would mean you'd be able to be treated privately because your insurance would pay for that. But there's no requirement to actually have health insurance, and our state system is so great that, you know, if you need treatment, you will get it. Anyone arriving on a visa which is valid for 24 months or longer is automatically eligible for that free healthcare. And obviously, once you've got residence, that continues. So teachers, so most people be eligible for free healthcare upon arrival. Just on schooling as well, if you have children, your children would be able to attend school as domestic students. So the same way that, you know, the children of a New Zealand citizen or resident would. So you only pay a nominal fee for your children to attend school every year.
On that note, Charlotte, for teachers, obviously we have teacher unions. There's a different one for primary, a different separate one for secondary. There is the option. There is some private health cover. If you're a member of a union, you know, that is quite a good package.
Yeah, some people ask about the perks. So salary is one thing, but do teachers get a particular set of benefits when teaching in New Zealand?
Look, I guess the flat answer would be no, but obviously there's the holidays. You know, our school term is structured with a 6-week summer break over Christmas and most of January. And then our school calendar year is the academic year, which of course a lot of overseas teachers struggle to get their head around if they're from the Northern Hemisphere. But there's a 2-week end of term break every 10 weeks. So the teaching year is actually quite short. It's 40 weeks. If you're a secondary school teacher, that final term, the senior secondary students are actually only at school for about 2 weeks after that end of that term holiday, and then they have their external exams to jump into. So if you're a secondary school teacher, your teaching year is even shorter. Yeah.
Cool. Some people ask whether, so they have a normal teaching qualification and they have a special needs qualification or certification on top of that. Is that an advantage? I don't believe it makes much of a difference as far as registration goes, but it could be an advantage for the job market, couldn't it?
Potentially. The bottom line is, can you get registered? So, you know, those qualifications would all be taken into consideration when you apply for the Teaching Council. And I mean, once you're registered, I guess from the employer's perspective, it's not so much about what qualifications you have, it's actually about what job experience have you got that's relevant for this particular role. Yeah, it's more about the experience from the employer's perspective. If you're registered, they know that's been taken care of. Someone's looked at the qualifications. You wouldn't have been registered without that having been done. So actually, how suitable is your experience for our school and for this role?
Cool. All right. Well, that's the end. We're nearing the end of the time allocated for this. Thanks a lot, Lynda and Charlotte. For our viewers, I see many questions are left unanswered in the chat. We haven't had a chance to cover them all. A lot of them are rather personal, so I'd like to encourage everyone to reach out to Lynda or Charlotte or myself, and again, we'll circulate those contact details. Have a chat about your employment opportunities with Lynda, by all means, and have a chat to either Charlotte or myself, Fabian, about migration opportunities, the process. As part of this webinar, we're offering all attendees a free eligibility assessment, which outlines the criteria under immigration policy to come to New Zealand. And yeah, it will answer most of your questions, if not all of them. And then as far as we're concerned, we'd love to have maybe a more private chat with you through Zoom or Skype at a later stage, once you have a chance to go through the assessment. And yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Lynda, Charlotte, anything else you want to say before we close off?
I'll just pop the candidate care team email in the chat here. If you drop us an email with a CV, you know, knowing that you've got a master's and you've taught for 5 years isn't enough to give you any kind of steer or guidance. We'd need an up-to-date CV so we can see really what you've done in the last 5 years, you know, over your career, and what your qualification package looks like. And then we'll get back to you after that. So yeah, an email letting us know that you attended this webinar with Fabian and Charlotte. That will give me a bit of context, and my team and I will you know, take it from there. I'll pop the email in the chat.
Awesome. Yeah, I think on a similar note, if you're contacting New Zealand Shores, once again, don't just email us saying what your qualification is and how long you've taught for. Our assessments look at a lot more than just that. So if you could send through, you know, if you're emailing Fabian or myself, please send through your CV and your date of birth, because from that we can prepare that eligibility assessment for you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot for your time, Lynda. Thanks, Charlotte. And thanks for everyone watching. You keep well, and we'll be in touch shortly. Cheers.
Awesome. Great.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.